Hello everyone and welcome again to ARCY3013, Experimenting with Archaeology. We stand on Noongar Wadjuk land and we're always mindful of the land we stand on, whose country it was and it is, and we always try and imagine what the future might be like and how archaeology might contribute to this. As usual, the image for this acknowledgement of countryside relates to the project for this unit about going along the Swan River, Derbal Yerrigan, and finding places of significance to all people from the deep past, the recent past, present, and indeed the future. So do bear that in mind when you're doing your assignments. Moving along, today is about the stuff of doing archaeology, doing fieldwork. So as a reminder, this unit has been structured in 3 parts in terms of archaeological project management. The stuff you do before fieldwork, so those have been the last 2 weeks and 2 lectures. The stuff you do during fieldwork, which is today, and the experimenting archaeology lecture, which is the next one, and then the stuff you do after fieldwork, curation, research, and digital heritage futures. We all love to do fieldwork, but we need to do it well. It costs a lot of time, it costs a lot of money, it takes expertise, it involves lots of people, it's lots of fun, but we do need to crack on with it. Now there will be some overlap in this lecture with the last lecture. There's no problem with that. It's what's known as layered and scaffolded learning, and these are simply concepts and practices we need to drill in again and again and again in order to practice archaeology and heritage management professionally. Right, so we have a pretty simple lecture structure today of a number of steps which I'll go through. So we'll just recap very briefly the pre-fieldwork preparation work from the last lecture, and then we'll get on to how we survey, how we use maps and datums, then how we excavate, just one of a range of techniques, but it will be something you'll be doing on the on-campus day, so it's good to have a lecture on that. Then how we record material in the field and do some preliminary dating of materials in the field on its stratigraphic basis of its stratigraphic position and or the features of the particular artifact. Something you don't often get in these types of lectures is in-field conservation. You can save a lot of time in the field by doing a bit of work on the conservation of the object. That saves a lot of time in the lab, for example. Also, we have to consider very importantly what stakeholders and the public think of our work, who's been part of our team, what promises we may have made to these people in terms of deliverables for our projects, and just spreading the word, so to speak, about history, archaeology, heritage. And I'll tie this all together with a recent case study from 2017 at Walyabuk or Belia Lake, a live situation in which archaeology was threatened by the Row 8 highway. So you're reading the Archaeologist Field Handbook pictured here. That whole book, you should read the whole book anyway, but the chapter on doing fieldwork is particularly relevant for this week. Righto, so from last week, recognizing artifacts in the field is a skill. So you first have to know where the artifacts and sites are, and you often find these from maps, photographs, a whole lot of desktop survey work you do before you get into the field. You also work on lab collections to see what stone tools look like, historic bottles, all of those different kinds of things. Now you can listen to as many of these lectures as you like, but there's no substitute for getting out there and actually doing the work, volunteering, doing interns, going on field schools, all of that kind of thing. When you work, sometimes you end up being wrong. We all make mistakes. What's important is that you've been consistent, that you're consistently wrong. So that's all okay. But if you've made the same mistake in a repeated fashion, it is possible for someone to go back and fix that mistake. But if you're using different terminology, one day you call it ceramics, the next day you call it pottery, that's very inconsistent and it skews the database. At a minimum, we need a coordinate for a site and we need a brief description of what is there. Depending then on the constraints of time, money, skills, etc., you can then give more or less information about that site. It's a really exciting time to be involved in archaeology. There are a lot of new and emerging and adapted technologies that can tell us a lot more than ever before. These are often non-destructive, field portable, really useful things to have. We do always have to recognize that our work impacts many other people, and we need to identify who these people are and what the impacts will be. The impacts are generally good, but sometimes there are restrictions on knowledge, confidentiality agreements with clients, and those kinds of things. And of course, all of our work has to be legal, ethical, and safe. And then you have to get the logistics in place before you go to the field, which can be a really big job. But that you can go over by looking again at the last lecture. What we want to do today is we want to get into the field. So with your research design, what you'll have done is you'll have consulted a wide range of documents. You'll have done your desktop survey, you'll have looked for maps, documents, photographs, sketches, spoken to your colleagues, spoken to affected parties, specialists, there might be ethnography. There are all sorts of ways of knowing about an area and the archaeology in the area generally, and sometimes sites in particular if they've been visited and recorded before. This saves you a lot of time in the field. Field time, though it's fun, is also money, and time that's often difficult to get when you're either lecturing, working on a collection, and all of those kinds of things. So you want to do your desktop work really thoroughly. So you want to make sure all that pre-field work stuff is thorough, is comprehensive, is consistent, and then you get into it. So number one, we survey. We get to the field, we've arrived there safely, we've made sure everything's in place, we've set up a camp, we've set up our first aid stations, we've got all of our safety and compliance networks and protocols in place, and now we decide we want to go and find these sites. Let's imagine it's an area that hasn't been surveyed before. So a very good way of doing things is doing pedestrian survey, just a fancy way of saying walking the area. But you don't just walk aimlessly. We generally walk along what we call transects. So what we'll do for a chunk of land is we will place surveyors a certain distance apart, 5 meters, 10 meters, something like that, and they have to walk in a straight line, usually along a compass bearing or determined by a GPS. They walk along that line, and every time they encounter something they might think might be an artifact, a site, an ecofact, a manuport, they then record it. They record the position and make a note. They then move on further, and then they find another site and another, and so they go on. When you've got a whole lot of people walking these transects, you then rapidly see in an area, once you map those out, where concentrations of sites and artifacts are, and that determines where you will do your field work. You might sometimes do surface sampling if you have the permits and permissions in place, in which you take samples of what's at each find point. Say now you're not going to do excavation this trip, but maybe next trip. This trip is a reconnaissance, and you need to show people who didn't come on this trip what's in the field. You then, with the correct permits and documentation, make surface samples, all geo-referenced, all with notes, bring them back to your place of work. They're examined, and on the basis of those surface samples, plus your map, your survey map, you then decide where to concentrate your work. More or less anyone can do this if you've got the skill to recognize artifacts. It can be challenging, it can be rocky, it can be wooded, it can be hot, it can be in an urban environment. You can't always walk a straight line, so competency with compass and GPS is really important. Other ways of testing are shovel testing. Again, I can't stress enough, this all needs to be done with permits and those sorts of things. This is common in the US, where you have a shovel, and sometimes people say a lot of archaeology, they reason that a lot of archaeology is under the ground, so a pedestrian survey will not always get all of the archaeology that's there. There are gaps between the survey lines, and even on the survey lines, the transects, the archaeology might be underground. So what you do at a predetermined interval, a regular interval, call it 10 meters, 100 meters, depending on the scale of your work, you then dig a little shovel test. So you take a shovel and you dig a hole, usually about yay big, usually about 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters deep, and see if any archaeology comes out over there. You might then do some sample excavation. So you'll see in this picture over here, they've set up a sample excavation square. So on the basis of shovel testing, found some evidence of artifacts, wanted to see if it was a single layer or it was deeper and part of a larger site. So put in a 1x1, put in their sieve station right next door, and we're having a look at it. So you can see sterile river sands underneath here and a humic layer with artifacts over there. Now sometimes shovel tests can take the form of backhoe trenching. So you get a backhoe in and you get a whole big trench going. This might seem very destructive, but it could be appropriate when you're doing large-scale survey work. You don't have time to do careful excavations every 10 meters. You want to see fairly quickly what's there, and on the basis of what your backhoe is telling you, you can then determine where a site is or a concentration of artifacts are. So the tools have to fit the task at hand. Sometimes the tools are small, sometimes the tools are large. As you can hear, you can see someone busy doing a shovel test. You make a neat little hole, look and see what's there, record it, including if there's nothing there, you record that. Then you fill up the shovel, the hole, because you don't want anyone breaking their ankle or livestock or anything like that. In this case, you'd put the turf back on, and ideally, no one would ever know that you're there other than having your photographs, your GPS coordinate, and your notes. Surveying can also proceed along what we call predictive modeling. So based on knowledge of where sites have been found in similar environments previously, you have an idea of where sites are likely to be. You can predict where the sites are likely to be. Now, you always have to look in areas beyond the predicted area, because people are strange animals and they sometimes do things for odd reasons, or what seem to be odd reasons. Or it might be just a different cultural logic. For example, in North America, there are some dream quest sites which are in very difficult, inaccessible locations which you'd never consider for a living site. But the purpose of the dream quest is to go through hardship, is to go through difficulty and danger. And so that site is in an unlikely place for a predictive model for a settlement, but is in fact in a very likely place for a predictive model for a dream quest site, for example. The long and the short of it is always have a look around and look as much as possible all around you. But to explain predictive models, so there are two kinds. The intuitive one, so you're an experienced field archaeologist, you've worked in an area like this before, and you say, there'll be nothing up that hill, I'm not going there, maybe here on the scree slope, it'll be there. But qualitative models have some data behind them. What you do is you take your insights and you look at other archaeological finds on maps and you discern patterns. Archaeology is really about discerning various kinds of patterns. And you see, there's a river. People tend to live along the river and at certain points in the river, perhaps. UWA is currently using predictive models to predict where terrestrial sites will be underwater. Remember, ocean levels in Australia only stabilised about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Australia's never looked like it has today in terms of its coastline, except way back about 120,000 years ago. At all other times, there's been more land. So people have been living on land that's now underwater. We'd like to excavate those sites using maritime techniques, but we need to know where the sites are. They're hard to find, so we need to try and predict where they would be. So based on our knowledge of land sites, we then say, right, we get bathymetry, the underwater maps, and we say that's where we would live, was this still land? And then we have a look over there. So that's more of a qualitative model where you're assembling a lot of different data into a formalized prediction of where you would find a site. And then you put your surveyors along and you give them instructions saying, look along the river courses or look on the mountaintops or do a random stratified sample where you look at a bit of everything, which is generally my recommendation. Getting lost is sometimes a good thing. You often find some quite interesting things. There are other techniques also that can help us with survey, the remote sensing techniques. So there are a whole host of these. You can use satellite photographs, aerial photographs. GPR here stands for ground penetrating radar. I'll get to that in a moment. So over here, everyone's heard of crop marks. So this is in the UK, a Roman settlement that has a surrounding wall, pathways and avenues. And these are at different depths in the soil, and they have different things like stone walls that affects the soil's ability to hold water, for example. So certain crops and plants will grow more or less well, giving you a kind of negative imprint of what's below the surface. So these crop marks these post holes over here will produce crop marks that are greener because they retain water more, for example. The wall repels water, so you'll have an area that doesn't grow as well. So you'll have these kind of positive and negative imprints of what's below the surface, and you can access those from above, from literally flying a kite with a camera. You could use a drone, you could use satellite imagery, you could use all of these different kinds of things. Once you're on the ground, you can use ground penetrating radars, magnetometers, various instruments that test the resistivity of the soil, so test its ability to conduct electricity, its water content, all of those things. In this picture over here, you have Jeff Schrag from UWA working with UWA Archaeology on Beacon Island. So what they were doing here is they're trailing this ground penetrating radar that's busy sensing below the surface if there are any anomalies. It can't tell you if it's a building or if it's a natural anomaly. but the shape of it, once you map it, gives you an idea. Something that's roughly 6 foot long, 2 foot wide, and 6 foot below the surface, for example, is likely to be a grave. So this on Beacon Island, they were looking for graves and structures of the survivors of the Batavia wreck in 1629. You can cover a lot of ground like this and tell more or less what's underneath the surface. So that helps direct where you will put your excavation pits. If you had to excavate all of this, it would take a very long time. So this technique is exponentially faster. Of course, you have to pay for the GPS and the specialist that comes with the GPS, but it's an expense that actually saves you money. So there are some tools that we use during survey to make our survey more effective, more targeted. Right, so now we've found our sites, we finished our surveying, we move on to the next section, which is site mapping and datum. So once we find a site, which can be a single artifact or it can be hundreds of thousands of artifacts, we now need to georeference it. We need to give it a coordinate, a south and east latitude and longitude, or UTM, whichever system you're using. In archaeology, this takes two forms. You have a coordinate on a GPS. So generally, you try and determine where the middle of the site is, whether you figure out the boundaries where the artifacts peter out. You come to the middle of the site and you take a coordinate. The satellites give you the coordinate. You save it in your GPS. You write it in your field notebook. You back it up and you save it in a number of different forms. And then if you're going to work on the site, you need to put a physical datum in. So the datum point is a physical point from which all other measurements on the site are taken. So if you're just measuring the boundaries of the site, they all need to be measured back to the central point so that you can map it. If you're excavating, the measurements go down into the soil, so you have X, Y, and Z coordinates, the Z being the depth, and those all come back to your datum point. The datum point is generally very simple. You can see this archaeologist over here is hammering in a peg into the ground. So the peg into the ground is going quite well, and you generally give it a northing and an easting over here, and this is your central datum point from which all references are being taken. So this is what we call tape and offset, or baseline and offset. This is linked up on the one side to the datum point. You run a tape off it at 90 degrees, you take measurements of different things so you can measure the site. That's one way of mapping the site. Or you can have a plane table. You usually set this up directly above your datum, so you'll have a datum underneath here, and then you'll site using a simple siting mechanism. A dumpy does this, a total station does this, and you site on different features around, and you relate those back to your plane table and map them along. Your plane table relates to this point over here, the datum. So it's a pretty simple concept, but it's one of those things that you need to do again and again. So find site, get coordinate, establish datum, and then by whichever means of mapping you're using, take a series of measurements that relate back to that datum point, so that later in the lab you can make a 3D reconstruction of that site. All of those points can be mapped in a program like AutoCAD, or you could even do it by hand, but you get an idea of the extent of the site, its different features, if you've been excavating, how deep they go, where all the artifacts are found in terms of their X, Y, and Z coordinates. Critically important. Always have to have this when you record a site. So datum, coordinate, site mapping. So sometimes we just do sketch mapping. There are lots of different ways of doing it. Again, it depends on how much time you have, what equipment you have, etc. Even if you have no equipment other than a tape measure and a notebook and a pencil, what you then do is, here's a photograph of people in the site, and you'll see various tape measures going off all over the place. So what you do is you have a datum point, you stretch out your tape measure, usually on a determined compass bearing, and you take measurements along it. You sit and record, and a colleague will then shout out, we are 3.4 meters northeast, for example. You'll put that down on your sketch map over here. And so you go on and map the site both horizontally, and if you're excavating vertically, or if it has structures above the ground, vertically going this way. You can have more formal mapping where you have a theodolite, sometimes known as a dumpy. It's this little instrument over here in the old days, and the total station, which is just an electronic form of the dumpy here. So you put it on a tripod. Notice over here, there's the datum point. That pink tape is on a peg that's been put in the ground, georeferenced, and that's your datum. You've now got 360-degree view in which you can map everything of relevance around the site. You can map it to within a centimeter or less accuracy. This is what we generally do in archaeology. So a total station is just an electronic dumpy. It stores all the measurements and it makes it easy to download at the other end. Of course, it costs quite a bit, usually about 15,000 Australian dollars, whereas a dumpy level is a couple of $100, and it doesn't need any batteries or any complicated equipment other than a good eye and an understanding of plane table mapping, which is one of the things we'll be doing in the practical sessions. And then you have another kind of formal mapping where you can map from the air. You can use satellite photographs, you can use drones to reconstruct 3D images with a scale and that are geo-referenced as well. So these are just some of the ways in which you can map. Sometimes you use all three ways of mapping, sometimes you might only use one or a combination of those. But that you map is important. You must map, you must put a datum in, you must put a coordinate. I know this is about the 5th or 6th time I've said it, and I'll probably say it several times more. Okay, now we move on to excavation. You found that you've surveyed, you found the site, you've done all your preliminary mapping, taking of notes, contextualizing what's there. Because remember, excavation is destruction, or as Gavin Lucas tells us, radical displacement. In other words, you can't put the excavation back together in real life. You can do it virtually in terms of your measurements, your X, Y, and Z coordinates, your photographs, your scans, all the kinds of records you're going to take. But excavation is really just one of many techniques we use in archaeology. Remote sensing can sometimes tell you all you need to know, and you don't need to excavate. Sometimes indigenous and other communities don't like the activity of disturbing the soil. There's spiritual and practical reasons for it. There could be historical reasons such as previous grave robbers, those kinds of things, which people simply say you can't excavate. Excavation is expensive. It takes a long time because it has to be done properly. It's careful. You have to take a lot of notes. It generates a lot of material that then have to be stored. Of course, we research these, but we do also have to store those. And those of you going into a heritage field, people in museums will tell you our storerooms are full, our collections aren't all well curated. Don't collect any more stuff, kind of thing. So there are a number of reasons you would not excavate. This picture over here is a large Upper Paleolithic excavation in France in which they've put a formal structure on the top to protect it from the rain because you want your section, that's the view from the side, so you have a plan view from the top and a section view from the side. This is going down the layers through time as people excavate. So excavation can tell you the history of a place by finding the actual objects, not just the objects. The soil contains information like pollens and pH and activity areas. Remember the Neanderthal urine episode? You could not have gotten that information other than by excavating. But bear in mind there are other alternatives to excavating, such as doing historical documents, interviewing people, using non-invasive probing techniques such as we've just been over, such as ground-penetrating radar. Maybe a series of small shovel tests is more appropriate than a single large excavation. As archaeologists, we also look for natural erosion. While we can't excavate unless we have permits, nature often does it for us in terms of erosion gullies by rain and wind, or little animals burrowing, and we can see if there's anything coming out there which can guide our thinking about whether we need to excavate or not. So the first step of excavation is to ask whether you need to excavate or not. It's a very powerful technique, but it's not appropriate in all contexts. Okay, so if we want to excavate, this list is some of the stuff that it can tell you. The sediment, the layers in which the artifacts and ecofacts occur, sometimes also called the matrix, that preserves a great deal of information. This is information we can use to date, so we can date things like grains of sand through optically stimulated luminescence dating. Amazing, 1 grain of sand, as long as it hasn't been re-exposed to sunlight, you can date that. Bits of charcoal through radiocarbon and accelerator mass spectrometry. We can use paleomagnetism, lots of different ways of dating. And the information, the artifacts and the ecofacts that we can date are there in that sediment. Also, this gives a context to the artifact. Single artifacts are of not much use to us. We want to know how they exist in relation to other artifacts, and that's all preserved in the archaeological deposit. We get a lot of environmental information. Australia has been particularly dynamic in environmental terms, ocean levels, more and less rain, things like the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. Information from that period is contained in the sediment in terms of animal bones. Little microfauna, for example, are very sensitive to climate change. So if you find certain kinds of mice in a site, whether they are brought there by humans or not, they are a proxy for what's happening in the environment around them. And sometimes excavating is really the only way to get at certain kinds of information, to ground truth it, so to speak. As you'll see in your textbook, it's a process. So excavation isn't just about digging in a hole. Here we have a nice flow chart which tells you then how to excavate. So you're now excavating a new unit. A unit are the stratigraphic layers, and it tells you all of the different things that you have to do: cleaning, photographing, drawing, calculating the stratigraphy, measuring the soil color using a standard Munsell chart. We will do this in the practical session. That gives an objective measure of color. Getting the pH, finding out if there are any activity areas through the relative acidity or alkalinity of the soil. The very soil texture can tell you a bit about the history of the site. Is the sand blown in? Is it washed in? Is it brought in by people? All of your different forms, the buckets that you fill up from your excavation, you've got to weigh them, you've got to tag them, they go off to be sieved, and all of those different kinds of things. So there's a lot more to excavating than just excavating. Like with this unit, there's a before, there's a during, there's an after. And it's careful work. Anyone can learn it. It's skilled work. But it does contain these and several other steps. So do have a look in the textbook and make sure you know what's going on there. On the learning management system, the LMS, Martin Gibbs, who's now at the University of New England but used to be here at UWA, has these really neat YouTube videos about how you lay out perfect 1x1 squares. We want squares that are perfectly square, 1 by 1, because we work out the volume of the deposit that's coming out, and we want to know, for example, how many artifacts there are per cubic meter. So we can't have 1.1 meter or 1 meter and 1 centimeter, because that skews our volumetrics. Also, if we're going to lay out more than one square in a large grid, if you're a little bit off with your first square, your second square is going to be a bit more off, and by the time you get to the 10th square, you've got a 1.2 meter square. So we need that standardization. It needs to be perfect. We use Pythagoras, and when you go to these YouTube videos, we can click on one, you can click on them in the LMS, and they're really, really useful because they very quickly run through how you do this. All archaeologists struggle with their squares in the first day of fieldwork.
There are several ways that you can possibly set up a 1 metre square for excavation or for surveying.
Basic tape measures.
I will just show
I won't spend a lot of time on this. It's on a sort of time lapse.
Hitting the
and
outer.
You can see how it goes along.
So you need to move this 1 metre line until it matches 1.414.
I can explain this as much
Then
as I
peg within.
like in terms of
Again, you'll see.
videos and things, but this is one of those things you really just need to get out there and do it. So have a look at those videos and practice as part of your backyard archaeology assignment, and we will then do it as a group in the group exercise, and we'll do it several times so that you get perfect 1x1s or 2x2s or 5x5s, but you get perfect excavation squares. Right, so when we excavate in 3 dimensions. We go across a horizontal plane, and then we go down vertically. As we're going down vertically, so across is the x-axis and the y-axis, down is the z-axis. Right, sorry, that's the y-axis, the x-axis. Always remember y to the sky, x-axis across the bottom, and then in this case the z-axis is going down into the ground through time. We have various laws that apply. So there's the law of superpositioning. This simply states that this layer, which is on top of this layer, will be more recent than this layer. Or put another way around, this layer had to be put down first before this layer happened. So stuff found in this layer, artifacts, will be older than layers up here. Unless someone has dug a pit, or you've had a burrowing animal bring a bit of artifact up from a lower layer into a higher layer, or there's been an erosion episode. There are several things called bioturbation or taphonomic factors, the stuff that happens in the soil that can displace where artifacts are. But as a general rule is the stuff on the bottom is older than the stuff on the top. So we remove these layers or units either by natural stratigraphy or by arbitrary units about 5 centimeters or 10 centimeters in depth. And every time we find an artifact, we map it, we plot it, we plan it. So each layer represents a different period of history, a different depositional event. So these terms here, strata, layer, unit, context, all relate to these layers that go back through time that you then excavate. Remember, you note here in terms of your X and Y axes, you have a scale, in this case, of meters. So this excavation has gone down 2.5 meters. It's quite deep. It gets stepped over here to make it safe, because if you've got 2 meters down, the walls can slump. We always have to work safely. And these are all areas where datable material has been found. It's been plotted. So for example, if you get a date of that sample there, you're happy that's nicely in the middle of your layer, and it represents a good average for that layer. Whereas a sample that's really near the top of a layer or the bottom of a layer, sometimes you're not sure if it's actually from the layer above or the layer below. But the general principle is we carefully excavate down through time, noting the layer and the finds in it as we go along, moving down deeper and deeper through time. We find large things, artifacts, ecofacts, and then we do things like take sediment samples. So we take a bulk sample of soil from each excavation unit or layer, and later we analyze it, the grain size, the grain shape, the pH, the soil color, all of those different kinds of things. And in this slide over here, this is of looked at under a microscope, where there are small fragments of bone in among the sand grains. There also, you see here, small fragments of charcoal that we could potentially date. And I'll get to this field site in a moment in our case study, but here you can see here's some baseline offset dumpy mapping happening. Here's the excavation happening, our perfect and safe excavation squares, recording going on. The blue tarp is in fact protecting a rare bread tree that is over there, so when we covered this up, that all looked fine. So we're looking for big things, we're looking for small things, we're looking at all sorts of different scales when we excavate. Right. While we're excavating and doing all of our other activities on site, we have to make sure we've got good records. And I've been over this a little bit in the previous lecture, but I'll go over some of it again, and then we'll move on to some in-field dating. So once again, you've got to be careful, you've got to be cumulative, you've got to be comprehensive. Remember, you might never get to that site again. If you're a research archaeologist, you might move on to a new research site. If you're a cultural heritage manager, construction or mining work might destroy that site and it's gone. So your records are incredibly important. That site is in the best condition it's ever going to be. It's going to continue to deteriorate over time, and so your records need to be really, really good. No pressure. These days we've got lots and lots and lots of different ways to record. Use more than one way, ideally 3 or more ways of recording the same information. That way, if something goes wrong with one of your recording systems, you've got more than one backup. So you've got site record forms, for example, over here. This is from the last lecture, in which you have these various details put in. You have your field notebook. You should always have a field notebook in which you record your finds, make sketches, make your notes, etc. Standardized excavation and recording forms, how you label your bags according to various keys, for example here. Sometimes, interestingly, this is just an aside, these are old labels from James Mellart, who excavated the site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And he had his business cards and used them to label his finds in his bags. And these have become themselves the subject of study. We move on sort of 50, 60 years, and we've got these new technologies. Labels, instead of writing this stuff out, increasingly people are using barcodes, RFID stickers, data matrix coding, and so forth. So you want a lot of different ways. Textual ways, writing it down, electronic on tablets, photographs, 3D models, scans, all of these different ways are good to record. You need to have an idea of what it is you're recording. This sounds obvious, but it's worthwhile going over. Do you have a little site? Do you have a big site? Is it a single component site, such as an historic dwelling that we know was lived in for 20 years and then abandoned? Or is it an area in which people have lived for thousands of years from different kinds of cultures? Because that gives you an idea of what sort of artifacts you should be looking out for and how you should be recording them, and also how much there is. So when you record, you don't necessarily take everything back for analysis in the lab. In some cases, the California Department of Transportation, for example, has what they call a catch and release process. In the field, what they do is they do 3D scans of the artifacts, and they then put the artifacts themselves into a plastic box, which they put back in the site, georeference it, and they take the scans back because they don't have space to store the material anymore. They just need data storage space. And then you've also got to give some practical thought to how are you going to organize the space of what you're doing. If you're excavating, you also need a sieve station. You also need a sorting station. You may need a washing station. You might need a labeling station. How do you store and transport goods? Here up in the Pilbara, notice how sieving can be extremely dusty. You don't want soil from your archaeological site to contaminate another potential archaeological site. So in this case, the sieving is happening on a tarp, and you will then put that material back in your excavated hole, for example. So there's a lot going on at a practical and conceptual level. This is from an historic shipwreck, for example, where a whole lot of wet sieving has been done of metal artifacts, and there's a large volume of them. You can see the condensation in here. Obviously, condensation in metal is not good. So in this case, you need to get this stuff chopped to the conservators. If it's stone tools, it's generally much more stable. Here they are washing and cleaning on site. But remember, you need a lot of drying time. Pottery, for example, can take 2 weeks to dry, even small fragments. And if you put one that isn't dried out in a plastic bag in a collection, it gets moldy and it gets destroyed. So these are some of the things you've got to think about recording and processing. There are issues such as human remains, so there are a whole lot of protocols that come into place there. The first one is you stop. You inform your supervisor that you found what you think might be a human remain. So you might have an archaeozoological specialist on site who could say, oh, that's a sheep, that's a pig, that's not human. But if that's identified as human, everyone stops. The police are called in, because at this stage we don't know if it's a modern crime, what the cause of death is, or if it's archaeological or not. Sometimes a coroner, etc., will be called in. If it's deemed to be archaeological, depending on your permit, depending on your stakeholders, you will either then move away from that person, or you might excavate the human remains. But they're a different category of find, and they require a different set of protocols. Similarly, on site you might be recording oral histories. There might be sites out in the Kimberley that are important to Aboriginal people that haven't visited them for a long time, or there might be historic sites where nearby residents have stories to tell you about who lived there. So these all have to be covered by an ethics clearance. The people giving you the information have to have free, prior and informed consent. They have to know what your project's about, who you are, or how their work will be, their words, their knowledge will be used, and there might be intellectual property agreements and various forms. You always have to have a form where a person formally gives you their consent to record their oral history. These are very valuable sources of information, but think of it as a kind of legal drama. You want to make sure that it's not inadmissible evidence because you've collected it in the wrong way and used it in an incorrect way. So it's not just artifacts that get recorded, it's things like people's memories that get recorded as well. All right, in-field dating. We have a number of ways of dating. When you're excavating, you are also dating. As I've said before, we have these laws in archaeology, the main one of the four being the law of superpositioning. Older stuff on the bottom, more recent stuff on the top. So as you excavate, where you find something, if you find it deep down, you know it is relatively older than the stuff above it. So that's what we call relative dating. This thing is older or younger than this thing. That's not absolute dating like radiocarbon dating, where you get a number associated, a date associated with that artifact. You can go through these laws at your leisure, but essentially they're saying going down, things are getting older. In the same layer, you expect things to be of the same age, of the same context in general terms. So that's some relative dating that's going on. There's also the artifact itself, and that can give you information as to its age. So I've got an archaeological and an historic example in this slide. So what we have over here is a Kimberley point. So it's a stone tool, a beautiful bifacially worked piece of stone that has these denticulate forms all along it, produced by a combination of direct percussion and pressure flaking. We'll do a bit of this in the experimental day. And we know from archaeological, securely dated archaeological context that Kimberley points, so it's about yay big, Kimberley points first appear, or bifacial points first appear around about 6,000 years ago, although pressure-flaked ones, bifacially pressure-flaked ones like this, occur only in the last 1,000 years. So if you find something like this, you know it's very likely, almost certainly within the last 1,000 years, or if it's a little rougher, it can be up to 6,000 years old. And then interestingly, have a look at this one. This is a Kimberley point made out of European glass. So Aboriginal people were very quick to identify glass as an excellent raw material for making stone tools. It was sharper. Here they've even got part of the maker's mark on the bottle available here. So you have Aboriginal technology in historic period, and you can give it an historic date. When you move into this historic period, there are lots of ways of dating different kinds of artifacts. So ceramics or pottery, In this case, we have the maker's mark on the base of the pottery. You take a plate today, you turn it upside down, it often has a stamp on the bottom. Those stamps are often time sensitive, and we can date when that ware was made. Also, the decoration on the pottery can be dated. Bottles, in terms of how they were made, do they have a crown seal? That stippling you sometimes see on the bottom of a bottle, so that doesn't move around on a surface, that comes in from 1940 to the present. These little dating tables over here come from the back of the textbook for this week. Similarly with nails, how they are made, we can date them. With bricks, with all sorts of artifacts, we can date them in the historic period, usually within a 5 to 10 year window of accuracy. So there are a lot of ways in the field in which you can get a good, reasonable, rough date of when your site or your layer is. Okay, so now you've done all of your excavation and recording, and it's time to do some conservation and rehabilitation. So for example, over here is a standard museum form showing you here are different kinds of material. This is from the Museum of London, and it's showing you could get antler, you could get basketware, you could get bone, animal and human, you could get copper, ceramics, fiber, etc. A whole lot of different kinds of material. So what's happening on it? Is there any sort of corrosion? You put notes on here saying there's a green corrosion, it's stable, it's breaking up. So as a conservator looking at this, you would prioritize. You'd say that one's stable, we don't need to look at that one over there. Oh, this one's breaking up, we need to have a look at that. Then you have to document the history of what you've done to the object, because it might have several conservation interventions through its life. So you can say, I've washed this, or you could say, oh, this is very delicate, don't clean it. Only let a trained conservator get in there. And then how must it be stored? Must it be stored in a dry environment, a damp environment? Over here you're not sure, so you contact an expert, for example. So you're making a whole lot of recommendations in the field that make the conservator's life easier down the track. So different materials need all sorts of different ways of treating them. As I've mentioned, pottery, you wash it. You don't always wash it, because if you wash it, there could be residues. Recently in Italy, wine, dated about 3,500 years ago, was found as a residue on the inside of a large ceramic container in a cave. If that had been washed, that information would be lost. So you don't always wash. Sometimes you might. You look to your conservator for guidance on this. Metal is always a bit of a nightmare, and this is a whole field we'll get into in terms of the conservation lecture and hands-on activity. And then if you've excavated, always you have to backfill. So ideally you leave the place so that if someone comes and they didn't know there'd been an excavation, they won't know. It'll look kind of as it did before. So a lot of this is simply on safety. If you leave a big hole in the ground, someone or something is going to fall in it and hurt themselves. So there's an OH&S reason. But also you might want to go back to the site and do more excavation squares. If you leave a square uncovered, the sides are going to start slumping in and it's going to fall down and you destroy the archaeological context. So what we generally do is we take something like plastic or a geotextile and we line where we have excavated. So if you want to excavate again, you know where the original excavation began and stopped, and you can start an excavation on the other side of the geotextile. And then from our sieve heap, we put the soil and that we've taken out of the hole back in the hole. So this makes things safe. Fieldwork is great, but it's roughly in a 1:10 ratio to the time you'll spend in the lab, for example. So a day in the field means sort of 10 days in the lab researching, conserving, doing all of those different things. You also have to make sure before you leave the field all your records are up to date and are neat. Don't say, oh, I'll do that later, because other things happen and you end up not doing it later, your records are incomplete, and then you've caused all of this destruction, excavation, and there's no record of what you've done. So we always backfill, we always leave the site as neat as we can find it. Then we move on to the public and our various stakeholders. So just go at the end of your excavation, say, right, who have I gotten permissions from, who has helped me, and who has been impacted on or by this project? What have I promised those people? Did I promise them a report, a public talk, an article, to do some training for some of their workers? Anything like that. And make sure you fulfill those promises within a timely fashion. Sometimes in the consulting industry, if you don't do this, you simply won't get paid. In other cases, you could potentially have other legal actions taken against you. But remember, a lot of archaeology and heritage management is all about reputation. So if you get a reputation as a tardy worker, people are not going to work with you much. It's not going to be a whole lot of fun. I'll show this in a little bit. This is a poster that we produced of our field school that we held in 2017. And this is just a visual record for a number of people interested in the project. They don't want to read through the big, thick report that was produced for this. They just want to have a nice poster of what was done. Remember, a lot of people in various countries are not that text literate, and so a picture does, in fact, speak 1,000 words. So we produced the poster and the report as part of our public and stakeholder engagement. And always be realistic about what you promise people. If anything, sort of slightly under-promise what you can do, rather than create expectations which are then not met. Archaeology can't always find out the truth. Larry Zimmerman, great archaeologist, he says archaeology is not in the business of truth, we're in the business of accuracy. We can be accurate in the way in which we work. Truth is a much bigger question. So just make sure you keep your promises, is essentially what I'm saying. Right, so let's tie it all together here at the end of this lecture in terms of a case study. So our case study was the Walyabup or Bibra Lake AWOS camp. AWOS stands for Australian Women's Army Service. So at UWA, at third year, we have a core unit called Archaeological Field Skills, ARCY3013. All students are required to take it if they want to major in archaeology. It's a lot of fun, but it teaches you the essential skills of being an archaeologist. You get a little taste of this in this unit, although this unit is more about project management, though there is some overlap of skills. Anyway, we like to put our students in real live situations in which they're not just digging a hole in the ground or surveying a bit of bush for the sake of upskilling themselves. We do want them upskilled, but we have, for example, worked last year in 2016, behind the WA Museum. That area is now gone with a $500 million redevelopment of the museum. We were looking for the geological survey from the early 1900s. The year before, we looked at Gallop House down on the Swan River to help the National Trust reimagine that heritage landscape. And in 2017, the Bibra Lakes Residents Association and the City of Coburn approached us and said, could we have a look at where they think the Australian Women's Army Service camp was in World War II, just opposite Bibra Lake. And what made this urgent was, at the time, the Row 8 highway was going to go through or near the site and would impact it and destroy a great deal of the site. It's not just the army history. This is an area of Aboriginal significance. It's on the AHIS register, for example. And so all of that heritage would be impacted. So we could help lessen that impact by finding material and by recording it. And so here you have the poster. There's a bit of press coverage. Here you see a poster from the time. The Australian women were, Army Service did things like manned, so to speak, searchlights, and did a whole lot of support services for the male combatant forces. You look at historic photos, well, let me get into it. So right, so our brief here are our stakeholders: Bibra Lakes Residents Association, City of Coburn, the native ARC, which was nearby, Southwest Aboriginal Land and Sea Council, and the Coburn Wetlands Education Centre, and of course UWA. So we wanted evidence of this World War II AWOS camp, which may have been a radar station, depending on which historic record is accurate, because they don't always agree with each other. There's not much known about women in the war, so there's a gendered aspect to it that was interesting research-wise. Similarly, was there evidence of Aboriginal occupation here from way back when through to the present? That would have been interesting to find. And interestingly, what about the trees and plants? Are there any that have heritage value? I'll get onto that in a minute. And then this is World War II, so there are still just first-hand and second-hand oral histories available for this camp. So those were part of our brief, or you could call it the research design, questions that focused our mind. So in the planning, we then had to say, right, where is this place? So it's roughly here where the square is. You'll recognize this interface from the AHIS map. So the AHIS map shows that this area of Bibra Lake, that's Bibra Lake and that's North Lake, are all a sacred Aboriginal site. Our site fell just outside of that. So in this case, we did not require a Section 16 permit to excavate. So the camp was located over there. There's an Aboriginal site coded 4017 along here. Stone tools, over 2,000 stone tools found. And this is a mythological and archaeologically significant site. Had our camp been a few meters this way, a whole lot of permits would have been required. As it was, this was on City of Coburn land. We needed their permission, which we got, and we needed various stakeholder agreements like the Bibra Lakes Residents Association, etc. So that was making sure of our legal compliances. For example, Walyabup is the Noongar name for the place. More laws in OHS, so Aboriginal Heritage Act was one of the laws, and the Heritage Act of 1990 was another one of the laws. And there are a host of local ordinances. You also have to phone dial before you dig to make sure you're not digging into gas lines, phone lines, internet lines, or anything like that. Inform your various stakeholders, receive comment, and inform the Southwest Aboriginal Land and Sea Council of any Aboriginal finds, for example. And before we went into the field, all of our students underwent training from archaeologists who had done this report over here in what the stone tools look like. As you can see, these are small little bits of crystal. They don't occur in that area, and quartz rather, that don't occur in that area. But if you're not trained, it'll just look like a piece of rock, and you will throw away an artifact because you think it is not an artifact. And we'll tell the story about this little critter later in terms of OH&S. Background research, there were maps, there was an auction after the war. Everything on the site was auctioned off. That was good for us because it had an inventory of all of the artifacts that were auctioned off. We didn't find them on site, obviously, but after the Second World War was a time of great shortage. All metal was reused, bricks, all of those different kinds of things. And we had things like the war diaries. There's an official war diary kept for every army camp. And for a long period of time it was classified, but it's now declassified and gave a unique look into daily life at this camp. So here, for example, this is an account of how someone caught fire on a particular day, here somewhere in May 1943. And the Sergeant Clark basically threw them on the ground, rolled them around and saved their life. What a fantastic source of information. We'd never recover that archaeologically, but in terms of our background research, we get it. And then Eileen Tucker, she was Eileen Riley at the time, she was one of the AWOS crew at this camp, and she wrote this book, We Answered the Call, which includes a lot of first-hand evidence. So that's a whole other background research that goes on. Photographs, so here's photographs showing the women and some men at this camp. And what was critical over here was this tree that they are in front of. And we managed to find that tree again. It's still there. This is Christine Cooper from the Bibra Lakes Residents Association who first approached us. So in fact, a natural piece of the environment, a tree, is one of the main positive sources of evidence that the AWOS were here. We've got this photograph provenance, these are AWOS women, and we've got that particular tree, and we find that particular tree again. Fantastic. Not an artifact, an eco-fact, if you like. And there are other things, such as this tree over here has a score mark in it from where a wire was put around for a large structure. The large structure has been auctioned off, but we have evidence of it being there in terms of this wire over here. So that was part of the brief about the trees and the fauna and flora, particularly the flora, having heritage worth, for example. Really interesting stuff. Right, so how we went about is our pedestrian survey. So this is the area we thought the camp would be, in this polygon over here. So what we then did is we put people at 5-meter intervals here along, this is along Hope Road, and we had them walk on a GPS and compass direction. We had them walk transects. Walk transects going that way, shift across one, move this way, shift across one, move that way. Recording every artifact they find as they go along. And this told us that the greatest concentration of artifacts was over here. So that's where most of the camp was. There were little concentrations in other areas, but otherwise you can see 72,800 square meters, 18 acres. It's a lot of land to search. We didn't find everything. We didn't find everything below the ground. We also did shovel testing in this area in particular. There seemed to be some interesting things, a fuel dump, but that's where the main camp was. So on the basis of our pedestrian surveys, we decided we would concentrate our excavations here. This graphic, by the way, is taken from the report that was produced as part of their student assessment. So all the students in this unit produce one report that they're assessed on, and that is given to the client. We don't charge money for it, but we treat it as a real-life situation. So within that area over here, we did some mapping with GIS, showing this hard-packed pathway over here, and then there and over here, and some various other hard activity areas, and this is where the excavations were. This is where our excavation trenches were, and there's another one over here. And that red dot over there, that's our datum point there. So this just overlain on an aerial photograph. That's our datum point from which we measured everything at the site. We chose that point because we could see most things from it. It was close to the main excavation, and it was easy to get in around it. So when we excavate, so there's our datum is just under here. We were using a total station. We set this up each day in exactly the same way. We used a ranging pole stadial rod like this, a measuring stick, from the total station to measure down into the deposit, to measure the corner of the archaeological square, so that we'd have X, Y, and going down Z coordinates. Very careful work. Some way away, we then had our sieve heap, and we would sieve things, finds that we would find in the sieve heap we would bag. That was our little unit code over here. Bibra Lake 002, it was our second site. XU, excavation unit 2, in square A2, light brown soil. So this is, and there you see a little button that was found in the sieve, a little military button, for example. So that's kind of how we laid out our excavation, sieving and sorting areas. You can see people taking notes, a lot of teamwork on the go. This was excavating that hard packed pathway. We thought there might be finds in among the limestone pathway. The limestone had to be brought in from somewhere. We still don't know where, but you'll see our careful one by one excavation squares. We're putting in the buckets over here. Here we've got a secondary datum, so that datum links to our primary datum, and we take measurements off here. We've got Gillian, our pit boss, keeping an eye over the big picture, and then we've got 2 students per hole, per square rather, one excavating, one sieving and recording, and they then switch around. So that way we keep really careful control over how and when we find things. We found a toilet block, so it's quite a substantial structure that we found. There were the toilets that had been a bit smashed, and the areas, changing areas in front of them. Again, we've got a secondary datum over here. We're taking measurements going down over here. Here people are excavating, taking notes, producing site diagrams like this. So this is the plan, the view from above, and this is the section, the view from the side. Now you'll see this little square over here, it's called a sondage. So we were excavating very carefully, but very slowly, and we wanted to know, were there artifacts further down? So what you do is you do a little test bit, or sondage, is you go quickly in a small area to see if there's something there. In this case, there didn't seem to be very much there. We were looking for Aboriginal artifacts, and so we decided not to dig any further than this. You can see the soil that's been brought in as building fill, and we stopped the excavation there. We found some strange features. Someone had taken concrete, broken concrete, and put it in a little row. We think this relates to the entrance to the toilet block in some way. Notice the high-vis vest, not so crucial in this excavation. The closed shoes, all the OH&S pegs get marked with bright tape so that you don't fall over them. Very careful cleaning and working going along. And then rehabilitating. So we not only filled it up, we put a number of branches on there because people were vandalizing the porcelain toilet. They were taking bits of it away and smashing it with rocks. So we made it hard for them to get to. Another area that didn't involve excavation but clearing, we simply cleared off a whole lot of leaf litter of what turned out, this is what we saw before, but what turned out to be a large shower block and laundry. It's got a little drain line running there. There are a few artifacts found along here, a sump that comes in here. There's some metal in the side here on which the walls would have been mounted, some bricks and so on. And that was just fairly simple clearing, and then extensive mapping and recording. Dwayne's recording there, Shelley's looking on, Gary, our site record board, etc. There was a septic tank. Archaeologists love septic tanks because usually when septic tank gets full, people start using it as a rubbish heap. All the human waste starts sinking down and people throw their rubbish in. So you get a lot of artifacts in there. And look at all of these artifacts we're finding here. This is where that long-necked tortoise comes in. I am over there, busy handing things out. You've got to watch your OH&S and safety. I was clearing the water out of this, and this poor little fella had fallen in. And I was cleaning out the water, and it jumped out at, well, it didn't jump out at me, but it seemed to. It seemed very dangerous at the time, and I bumped my head, and it all started bleeding. To give you an idea of what we found in the septic tank, is we found bricks, a lot of ways of dating bricks, pipes. You see the maker's marks on the pipes, we date those. Porcelain, intact bottles, medicine bottles, wood and jarrah wood things, all of that. Star picket over there. We recorded this and then we put it back in the water where it had been preserved and closed up the septic tank to make it safe. So this was a case of we only took a representative sample back to the UWA lab and left most of the archaeology on the site. Then comes the work of tabulating the finds, the research. So things like a cardip brick. So WA used to import most of its bricks from the UK. But the cardip factory was established to make bricks here, and we know it manufactured bricks between 1926 and 1924, so you know you've got a range of how old that brick is. You can read through this at your leisure at a later time, but you see the type of artifact, what it's made from, where it was found from. All of these codes are giving you the exact position in terms of X, Y, and Z axis. And here's some notes about its type, possible dating, all of those different kinds of things. Similarly, the medicine bottle, 1920s to, that's meant to be the 1990s. That's not particularly informative. It gives you a 70-year range, so you have to find other things in which you can date it. So these are things from the septic tank that have date ranges. There's that brick that you had here. You've got a 40-year range for some asbestos, for example. And then there's public awareness. So we had a table at site. We had lots of visitors coming each day, people who were interested, people who'd been involved. We had finds on the site. We had 2 public officers. 2 students were designated public officers each day. And as soon as someone came on site, they would go escort them to the site. That keeps them safe. And they'd also show them what's going on. And so there was a bit of press coverage as well. Here we've got people excavating and so forth in the local newspapers. And that's all good for archaeology. There was nothing confidential or sacred or anything here. And we're happy to share all of that information. All right, so when we think about the evidence for this being an AWAS camp, the evidence was actually quite sparse. There wasn't a lot of material culture that told you that there were women there. It certainly told you it was an army camp. We had things like the barbed wire and the military buttons. But there weren't a lot of artifacts. The camp was thoroughly cleaned out when it was decommissioned. But things like the photograph and the tree, those were really important. The artifacts and what we found, the fact that you had this large number of loos out in the bush, this was not what you would have for a farmhouse. This talks about some kind of camp. So these are our research design. We had our research design at the beginning about the gendered aspect, and these are then our findings in terms of it. What we found out, was it a military camp? Probably, not so sure. You've always got to think about these things. Was there a female Aboriginal presence? It's equivocal, probably, but we don't have huge artifactual evidence for it. The flora is definitely heritage worthy. Oral histories were definitely a future way of doing research. So once you've done your research, you say, here are the gaps we could have done more of. In our case, oral histories would have been useful. We didn't intend to do a lot of oral histories, but they proved to be one of the main ways we could find out about daily life on the camp. Other documents, such as going through those war diaries, would be more useful as well. Right, so what would the next steps be? In this case, to get a site management plan together so that this could be developed as a heritage resource for the city of Coburn, possibly for a heritage trail. This can be done on-site and online, for example. The artifacts, where do they go? We don't keep them at UWA. We've just analysed them, and we then hand them over to the Azalea Lee Museum, which is the repository. And you'll always hear our archaeologists say this, we need more research. And then we produce this final report. So this was the final report. Here are all the authors of the report, not one of them a lecturer. We as lecturers certainly looked over and did quality control, gave advice, worked as a team, but this was a student project, a really great student product, and this is what we handed to our stakeholders, for example. Righto, so as a summary of today, that's quite a lot to take in, is that fieldwork is fun, but it's careful, it's cumulative, and it's comprehensive. The basic principles of recording a site in terms of getting a coordinate, data mapping, in-field recording and dating, and careful chain of evidence way of working applies wherever you are. Sometimes you'll do it more or less thoroughly depending on the time, money, people, skills available, but these will all help recover the research potential of a site. It's a great deal of fun. It's even more fun when you do it properly, because then it's socially relevant, it is of interest to the research community, and man, it's a lot of fun. So that concludes the lecture for this section, and then the next lecture will be a bit more on experimental archaeology.